This morning, I want us to think about our series that we've been looking at, and I'm always cautious to use the word series when I talk about sermons because then folks think long and drawn out. But our series, or at least the subject we've been covering over the past month, has been the subject of love. And really this morning, we ended last week with the idea of loving our enemy. But I want to give us something to think about this morning with regard to our love for the poor. Our love for the poor. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 10, the Apostle Paul was writing to the church at Galatia who had been struggling with some various issues and problems within the congregation with regard to their work, with regard to doctrine, all types of different things. But the relationship between the Jew and the Gentile and how they were able to come together into one body, there were instructions that were being given as to what their responsibilities were. And one of the admonitions that he gave was, remember the poor. Remember the poor. I want us to keep that thought in mind this morning as we venture into this particular sermon, remembering the poor. You and I live in God-blessed America. And I didn't expect you to stand up and salute or to say the national anthem because I've got my flag tie on this morning. But, we're proud, generally speaking, as Americans, we're proud to live in America. We're blessed in America, blessed more than perhaps any other nation on planet Earth has ever been blessed. We have tremendous resources in our nation. In fact, when we think about the poor of America, the very poorest among us, at least it seems, is still wealthier, if you will, than most of the rest of the world. Yet we do still have those who are among us who are in need. There are those who are in need of food. Believe it or not, this congregation has supported those in our community who have been in need of food. We've also had those who've needed clothing, and those who've needed shelter, and those who have needed other things. We have children of family members who have been in need of various things, and this congregation has helped in that area within our community. Keep that in mind. I want us to realize, first and foremost, as we enter into this study, that there has always been a place in the loving, caring, kind heart of God for those who are in need. God has had a special place for those who are in poverty. In the law, Deuteronomy 15 and verse 7, listen to what Moses writes to the children of Israel. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend to them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The seventh year, the year for canceling debts, is near. So that you do not show ill will toward the needy among you and your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. Then they may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Verse 10, give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you put your hand to do. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. I find it interesting as we read this passage, there are a couple things that stick out to me with regard to this. Number one, he's telling them, when you give, don't do it grudgingly. Does that sound familiar? Paul talked about that to the church at Corinth, didn't he? Both in 1 Corinthians 16 and 2 Corinthians 7, chapter 7 and 8. And then with Jesus, there will always be poor people in the land. Jesus made this statement, the poor you have with you always. He was quoting from the law. But the Israelite had a responsibility toward the poor among them to care for them. And God said, I want you to care for them. I don't want you to be tight-fisted. I don't want you to be hard-hearted toward them. I don't want you to think when that seventh year comes, oh no, now I have to cancel my debts. God had that in place so that no one would ever be so bound to another that they were basically enslaved forever. I think about the wisdom writings. We got the law, but what about the wisdom writings? In Proverbs 19:17, by way of study, I'm going to let you know, this is a very small sliver of all you can read about the poor. In the wisdom writings in Proverbs 19:17, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Have you ever thought about, Gary, lending to God? You pull out your pocketbook and you say, okay, God, how much do you need? We don't tend to think about lending to God that way, but yet when we give to the poor, that's what the Proverbs writer is saying to us. We are lending to God. In Proverbs 22 and verse 9, the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. And the prophets, so we've looked at the law, we've looked at the wisdom writers. What about the prophets? The prophets, in Isaiah 58 and verse 10, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. Sounds a lot like what Jesus said when he said, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Jesus himself in Luke 14 and verse 13 said, but when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. We're going to come back to that thought here in just a moment. I don't see us being surprised then when we look and read in the book of Acts and we read of the work of the church and we read in the epistles how much the church was involved in aiding and helping the poor. We have the church in Jerusalem as an example, Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. After the gospel was preached that first Pentecost and people were responding to the gospel, people wanted to stay longer. They couldn't help but to listen to the apostles preach. And what did they do? Those that were among them provided for those who were traveling in from afar. You read Acts chapter 4, when the church had need. The Bible tells us that there were those who sold their possessions. We'll come back to that as well. And gave to the poor. Then there's a remarkable example of the churches of Macedonia in 2 Corinthians 8, verses 1 through 4, who first gave of themselves and then gave beyond their means to provide. The churches of Macedonia were very poor people in a very poor congregation. And yet when Paul was writing to the Corinthian church, which is known for its wealth and opulence, he said, use them for an example. They gave of themselves and they gave beyond their means in order for the poor to be supported. Paul in particular was engaged in helping poor Christians. He was asked to remember the poor. Again, Galatians 2, verses 9 and 10, our text. But he instructed the churches on how to take up a collection for the poor. You know, we do that on the first day of the week by example. 1 Corinthians 16, we read verse 1 and following, that the church took up a collection on the first day of the week, that there would be no gatherings when Paul came. That's the example we have. Now, we use our collection today to support such things as the lights and the building and the heat, and we have padded chairs to sit in, and we have resources, a chalkboard, these things that we use for learning and study. And yes, we do help the poor, but I think it's important for us to remember now, again, that 1 Corinthians 16 and that contribution was not for a building and for lights and for heat and all these things that we get to enjoy. That collection was taken up for the poor. It was taken up for those who were starving because of the famine. You see, I think sometimes we lose sight of contexts. He instructed the church as to how to take up the collection. Then he accompanied the collection to the needy saints in Jerusalem, as he talked about in Romans 15, verses 24 and following. I think we have a tremendous example in the first century church as to how we ought to be those who take up a collection and remember the poor. But brethren, sadly, I think today there are too many who want to revile the poor more than they want to remember the poor. They want to look for a reason why the poor are poor. They want to place or ascribe sins to individuals as a result of their poverty. And so they look for reasons. Let us not forget the book of Job, the man who went from riches to poverty. And while his friends came in and said, it must have been some bad thing you did, Job. You need to repent of something. Figure it out. We find out the whole time God was testing Job to prove a point to Satan. And those friends truly were off base in what they had to say. We'll talk about that ourselves here in just a moment. You know, sometimes it's the case if somebody's asking for help, we assume automatically they must be lazy. If we're inclined to help, the poor are expected to earn what they're given, sometimes told to pay it back. Yet God has chosen us to bless the poor. Galatians 6:10, we're to do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith. James says, has not God chosen the poor of this world, rich in faith, and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? We forget that. And so I wanted this study to be important to us because it's obvious this is a grace that you and I must exhibit in our relationship one with another in the community in order for us to have the right relationship with God that we should have. And so I'm going to ask a series of questions and we're going to look biblically into the answers for them. Number one, who is a poor person and what is poverty? The poor. Those we consider poor, we oftentimes think they absolutely have nothing or very little. We notice the widow. You remember that Jesus talked about the widow and her mite. Jesus sat opposite of the treasury, the Bible says. He saw how the people put money into the treasury and that many people who were rich put much in. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrant. And so he called his disciples to himself. You know, when Jesus called his disciples, I could almost see the excitement, Mark. Come here, check this out. He's been watching the giving, and he watches this widow come in and put in her 2 little mites, and he says, come here. And notice what he says. Assuredly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who've given to the treasury. You know, if we had a millionaire sitting in here, I don't know. We had a millionaire sitting in here, and they dropped $100,000 in the plate on Sunday morning. We say, wow, that's a lot. Wouldn't we? We'd be impressed. But what about the person who has so very little and gives all they have? Listen to what Jesus said. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. Imagine that. I think of the saints today who, like the widow, give their mite. By the way, it's found in Luke 21. Congregations have those who have wealth. And oftentimes they're very generous with what they have. Sometimes they're not as generous as they could or maybe even should be. But then you think about those poor among us who give of all that they have. In Jesus' day, it would have also included those who have enough to offer meager sacrifices. You've got those who are poor like the widow who gave all she had. You had those who were able to offer, but they offered the meagerest of sacrifices according to the law, Leviticus 14, verses 21 and 22. And it shows that the sacrifices of the poor were still respected by God. You had the sacrifices of the wealthy. Maybe they chose the unblemished lamb, the best lamb that the herd had to offer. Yet the poor in their meager sacrifices were just as pleasing to God. And so it tells us that one does not have to be absolutely destitute to be considered poor. And it also shows us, by the way, that sacrifices were still required of the poor. Sometimes folks will become members of the Lord's church and they'll think, well, I have meager means, so I don't have to give anything. Well, that's not true. God still required of the poor to make an offering. What can be some of the causes for poverty? And this really gets to us. This is where the rubber meets the road, if you will. We, again, think to ourselves it has to be laziness. And certainly sometimes it is due to the sinful actions on the part of the individual. Laziness can indeed be a cause of poverty, according to Proverbs 6, verses 6 through 11. But there are also times that there are individuals who refuse to heed instruction, as Solomon writes in Proverbs 13:18. I knew a young man who was very promising. He had gone to university. He was in his last year. He took a job that was willing to pay him a large salary for him to do what he was doing to continue his school, finish his degree, come to work with them. And he did well for a short period of time. But then he began to be very rebellious, both within the school, failing classes, and within the workplace environment, not giving heed to those who gave him correction and leadership regarding his job. And on one occasion, he finally became so angry, he actually went out into the parking lot and smashed in the window of a co-worker's car. Well, all of it was caught on camera, and he was fired. He lost his ability to pay for his college, so he had to drop out. And a young person who has almost earned his master's degree had to go to work delivering food goods for a meager wage, and became relatively involved in poverty as a result of his unwillingness to heed correction. In Proverbs 21:17, there are those who seek pleasure. Proverbs 23:21, drunkenness and gluttony is mentioned. Other times it's due to sinful actions on the part of other men. I think this is hard for us to accept. You know, I can control myself, but if I get out on the highway and somebody has been drinking and driving and they smash into me and cause me great bodily harm, sometimes there is no recourse for that. Sometimes there's not enough of a recourse for that to provide for myself or for my family. I think about individuals who engage in sinful behavior that affects others. I think about usury and extortion, Proverbs 28 and verse 8. We have a modern day equivalent to that, these check cash places. I've known people who got involved in that, writing these checks, and the fees become so exorbitant that they will never pay their way back out of those check cashing places. They go back week after week and write another check to cover the other check and pay the fees. They work all week long. Next thing you know, they build up the fees. They can't get beyond that thing, and that usury, that interest builds up and up and up until they can't pay it off. I think that's sinful. I think it's sinful. I think about greed in general, Isaiah 3, verses 14 through 15. That was one of the downfalls of Israel. They were greedy landlords. We got greedy landlords. We've got greedy store owners. We've got greedy repair facilities. We've got greedy spouses. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why we might fall into a matter of poverty. Unfair labor practices, Jeremiah 22:13. The Israelites had problems with those that were initiating unfair labor practices, and certainly that happens today too. A man's worthy of his hire, yet there are some who do not pay them for their work. Amos 4:1, sometimes it's oppression that comes from outside. This could be motivated by a host of things: one's race, one's sex, political positions, religious convictions. And that leads us to persecution. 2 Corinthians 8, verses 1 and 2. The churches of Macedonia were amidst great persecution. Of course, there are other things that happen that are beyond our control. It might be a natural disaster or a plague. I think of the small business owners here in Rogers City that lost their businesses because of COVID. Jerry and I sat in a restaurant. We sat in a restaurant that had just newly opened. It was the first day. We were sitting there ordering, and then the owner came by table to table and said, "I'm sorry, folks, you're going to have to finish up. The governor has ordered us closed beginning at 1 o'clock. That business is no longer in business. They never had a chance to even get it started, really. I think about God's chastisement. It was the case in Haggai's day and Malachi's day. God was dealing with the people in their situation and dealing with the sin in the nation, and because of that, there was great poverty among the people. It can also be due to a voluntary choice. I've seen that on a number of occasions. We had a young man who came here on his bicycle years ago, and he had chosen that solitary, homeless lifestyle. When he came here, he was in need of food, he was in need of shelter, he was in need of clothing, so we got him clothing and we got him food, and I took him down to the homeless shelter. He spent the total of 1 day there. Reason being, the second day they asked him to go across the street and file for a job with Star Staffing. He had to register for a job and then House and Urban Development to see if you can get into housing. They do a good job up at the shelter getting you out of the shelter back into a home of your own. And he didn't want that. And so he left the shelter and continued on his bicycle. There are some who choose that lifestyle. And so we find lots of reasons for poverty. We need to be reminded from time to time, however, according to Psalm 69:33, God hears the cries of the poor. God made provision for the poor with you and I. He did under the Old Testament law. The poor were not to be charged interest, Exodus 22:25. The fruit of fallow ground during the 7th year was for the poor, Exodus 23, verses 10 and 11. They were allowed to glean the fields after the harvest, Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. You remember Ruth? They could satisfy their hunger in the vineyards and the grain fields. I remember Jesus' disciples, what were they doing as they were going through the grain field? Luke 6:1. They were gleaning the grain and eating it. Remember, the Pharisees took that occasion to try to charge Jesus with working or laboring on the Sabbath day. Debts were to be canceled every 7 years, as we mentioned in Deuteronomy 15. Hebrew slaves or indentured slaves had to be set free after 6 years, Deuteronomy 15. Israel was charged to be careful in their attitude toward the poor, as we had mentioned in Deuteronomy 15. And so what does God say about the poor? We mentioned the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 14:21. He who despises his neighbor sins, but he who has mercy on the poor, happy is he. Proverbs 14:31, he who oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, but he who honors him has mercy for the needy. Proverbs 17:5, he who mocks the poor, keep that in mind, reproaches his maker, but he who honors him has mercy on the needy. Proverbs 17:5, or Proverbs 19:17, he who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord. Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will not be heard, Proverbs 21:13. The person with a generous eye will be blessed, having given to the poor, Proverbs 22:9. He who gives to the poor will not lack, but he who has eyes will have many curses. Even the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31 extends her hand to the poor and reaches her hands out to the needy. You say, well, Dale, that's a lot of passages we looked at. I've touched the hem of the garment. I'm telling you, God has a lot to say about our obligations to the poor. If the book of the law of Moses and the writings of Solomon, the Old Testament wisdom, display such a concern and provision for the poor, should we be surprised then to see how much it was practiced in the first century church? You see, the gospel calls for us. Jesus commanded us. Matthew 5 and verse 42, give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. That sounds a lot like Deuteronomy 15, doesn't it? In his Sermon on the Plains, Luke 6 verse 34, and if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you'll be called the sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil, therefore be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. I'll tell you the passage that haunts me is Luke 14 and verse 12. Then he also said to them who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now I want to ask this question, and I'm not doing it to shame any of us, but I'm doing it because I had to ask myself. How many of us do that? Really? How many of us have ever thrown a feast for the poor among us? Even the congregation here who has kitchen facilities, when was the last time we opened this building up for those who have a need? It's an important question, brethren. We need to be honest with ourselves. Are we willing to do this? Jesus said it right here. He said it right here. Are we willing to follow through with what Jesus said to do for the neediest that are among us? Are we willing to help the poor? You think about the New Testament, throughout the epistles, and I wish we had time to read every single one of these passages. We don't. But I'm going to give them to you, and I hope that you'll write them down. Paul, in several of his epistles, Romans 12:13, he talks about feeding those who are our enemies. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's naked, clothe him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In so doing, you'll heap coals of fire upon his head. 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 through 19, charge those who are rich in this world to give. The writer of the epistle to the Hebrews in Hebrews 13:16, but do not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. I want to sacrifice to God. All right, have you sacrificed for your fellow man? In 1 John 3, verses 16 through 18, whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need, but shuts up his bowels of compassion, how can you say the love of God is in him? The local church has a responsibility. The needy saints, the churches were charged how to provide aid. We talked about those passages in 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians chapter 9. You see, the church also talked about our own personal duties. We still have duties to our family. 1 Timothy 5:16. If a man provide not for his own, he's worse than an infidel. He's denied the faith. I have a responsibility to my wife. I have a responsibility to my parents. It should come from the household first. As we have opportunity, it's the duty of each one of us to do good unto all men, Galatians 6:10. Let me give you another verse to think about. I love the book of Ecclesiastes. I hope you do too. I hope you've taken time to read the book. The book of Ecclesiastes is an amazing book because it's all about Solomon's quest for purpose under the sun. You read that phrase, under the sun. He's dealing with everything that takes place in this world. And so he says, I'm looking for purpose in this world under the sun without God. And you know what his conclusion is? You reach into the book, fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole of man. In other words, I can't find real purpose without God. But in Ecclesiastes 9:10, he says, whatsoever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no purpose in the grave to which you're going. You have no more ability to do good once you're in the grave. Do what you can do while you can do. Years ago, steam engines ruled the rails. I don't know if you like steam engines. Jerry and I, we like to ride the 1880s train out of Keystone, or out of Hill City, South Dakota, up to Keystone and back. If you're ever out there, that's a bucket list thing. I mean, you get to ride on a train that was built in the 1800s and see what it was like to have to be in the bellows of that smoke coming back on you. But what a great experience that was, to realize these great, magnificent steam engines and what they used to do. But the tanks on those engines were very large and dark inside. It's hard to gauge the amount of water that was in there. So what they did is they developed a glass tube on the outside that matched the amount of water that was on the inside, so they could see how much water was in there so they could fill it to the capacity. The indicator tube. This morning I want us to be thinking about that in terms of who we are and what our indicators are for our immense love for God. I believe the indicator for our immense love for God is measured in our love for our fellow man. John would say, if we can't love the brother whom we see, how can we say we love God whom we cannot see? One can measure to a great extent our measure for our love for our fellow man by our love for the poor. Let's not forget that in all these studies we've been talking about the fact that this word agape, love, is an action word. It is a verb, not a noun. Can we see why the early church was so diligent to help the poor? They were not only obeying the commandments of Jesus and his apostles, but they were displaying compassion as is characterized by the people of God. Brethren, are we known in our community for our compassion? And it's not enough to say, well, the preacher's known for it. That's good. I wouldn't hire a man to be the preacher in a congregation who is not known to be a compassionate person. But brethren, we ought to be known as a congregation of compassionate people. We ought to be known by our community as those who love God by loving each other and loving the world. It is a demonstration to our brethren who face trials and difficulties and losses and poverty. We're able to exhibit compassion to them by reaching out to them and help them in their needs. It demonstrates our love for the unconverted, for non-Christian folk among us. No one cares what you know until they know that you care about them. James says it does you no good if you say to one who's in need, be warmed and filled, but you give them not those things which are needful. A lot of evangelism goes like this. We want you to come to Jesus. We want you to have salvation. And in the midst of their poverty and their struggle and their worry about their next meal, nothing is done. How then could we possibly expect them to desire heaven when they see no compassion exhibited on our part? What did Jesus do? On numerous occasions, he fed the multitudes. It's hard for somebody not to see your love and care and concern when you provide for them a meal. There are certainly good reasons to remember the poor. According to Psalm 41, verses 1 through 3, those who do so are blessed by the Lord. James tells us that we are rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom when we do it. 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17 gives us a strong warning. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. We've got to be careful not to be so drawn to our possessions that we forget that we're going to leave them all behind. What can we do to remember the poor? We can give liberally into the Lord's treasury. That's what the first century church did. Paul said you do that so that when I come, there's no need to scurry about and try to raise a contribution. It'll already be there when I come through. I can gather it and take it with me. We need to have a strong fund for the church to be able to help those who are in need. We can give liberally when the opportunity comes. This may be out of our own pantry. And I can tell you from experience, and not patting myself on the back or Jerry either, but our pantry has been open for those who have had need ever since we've been Christians. And we have never gone without. Just because we gave to somebody else, we've never gone without. Sometimes our own savings account. Sometimes our own coin jar. Somebody has a need and I don't have it by me in my savings account, my bills are due, but I take what little bit of savings I might have set aside for something else and give it to that person for their need. The Lord has never failed to provide. We can give to charitable organizations within the church, plenty of orphan homes in the church. I think of Schultz Lewis, it helps out troubled teens. I think about the Churches of Christ Disaster Relief Fund. You can go online and find that group. They do tremendous work around the nations. I think about locally. We've got the Atlanta Church of Christ has the Caring Place. If you've never been there, go there. It's like a store. It's right next to the church building, the building that they have. You can grab a grocery cart. They got a grocery cart. You can walk around the store and get clothes. And they've done that through donations from congregations across the state. We'll send clothes to the Caring Place, and they sort them out and clean them up, and those that are indigent can come in and get shoes and clothing, and then they have a pantry set up, and they have that open twice a month. And they've contacted stores like Walmart and Meijer and other places to have food donations from foods that are about to expire, and they bring those in and they give those out in that place. They do a tremendous work with that. You can give to that. You might just give your time. Dale, I don't have a lot of money to give. Okay, they're always looking for volunteers to help them at the Caring Place, to hand out food, to sort through clothes. There's plenty we can do, brethren, when it comes to helping the poor. We need to honor God and glorify Christ by remembering the poor. When those opportunities come locally, when those opportunities come regionally, and yes, even globally. I want you to keep one verse in mind, Galatians 6:10. We've mentioned it earlier. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those in the household of faith. Brethren, that's a command. That's not an option. That's not a suggestion from God. That's God saying to us, I'm going to gauge your love for me by your love for your fellow man. No greater love than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus said, you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. This morning, you may need to respond to the gospel, being baptized into Christ, or as a child of God, you might need the prayers of the church. We want to encourage you to do that. We have number 454 picked out. We're going to sing the first and last verse. If you have a need this morning, won't you come while together we stand and sing? What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Nothing can for sin atone. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Not a good that I have done. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Please be seated.